Hello everybody, and welcome to Fertile Ground with Mike and Coach. My name is Mike Cornell, and I'm alongside Coach Ron Lathey. Have you ever been faced with a situation in your life where all you had left really was to trust God? Well, today's segment is going to take a really close look at that, Coach.
Yeah, it's going to be a hot one too.
I've heard it's going to be a hot one. Should be a good hot lesson for us here today. And as we get started, we have three things we would like for you to think about and to consider. And the first one is this: what consequences do Christians face today for standing up for what is right? And this is a really good spot while you're thinking about that to grab a pen, grab a piece of paper, grab your Bible, and follow right along with us here today. Second of all, how can we cling to our faith when it feels like our whole world is crumbling? And then finally, does God always deliver us from our trials? And today we continue with the International Sunday School series. And Coach, here we go. Last week, the title of our study was Faith in the Power of God. And we were actually in the book of Isaiah. And we continue with this theme of faith throughout the Bible with today's study. And it is called Faith in the Fiery Furnace. And we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3, looking at verses 19 through 28. And Coach, could you just kind of set the stage for us and give us the context of where our lesson begins today?
Yeah, sure. Today we're in one of my favorite books of the Old Testament, the book of Daniel. Daniel is not a long book, but it's got some great stories in it, some great things about prophecy. In fact, I tell people, if you want the unabridged, condensed version of Revelation, read the book of Daniel. Sure. Because it follows right along. And in fact, a lot of Daniel's prophecies are fulfilled in the book of Revelation, including what most people have heard of called the 70 weeks of Daniel. Right. And so there's a lot of relationship here because of the way Daniel relates to Revelation. Now, what Daniel's talking about here, where we were last week when in Isaiah, we were about 100 years before the Babylonians came and overran Jerusalem. Today's lesson is right in the middle of it, of the battle. And in fact, the battle's over, and the Babylonians have they actually made 3 trips there to Jerusalem. And finally, in the last one, they destroyed the temple and the city. And in the first one, they took a lot of people back with them to Babylon. And that included Daniel and his friends that we're going to talk about today. So, this is a time period when the Israelites are now out of their country. And we see that we're going to see what Jewish life was like when they were in captivity. And so we're going to focus in on 3 of Daniel's friends that most people have heard their names before. One was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we know that these 3, along with Daniel, were actually, when they got to Babylon, they were very impressed. The Babylonian king was impressed with these kind of young men, and he actually took them in, and they rose into power in the Babylonian government there. So the king's name that we're going to talk about is Nebuchadnezzar, and he is the Babylonian king at this time. And so we're going to talk about what happens when these Daniel in this case is actually absent from our lesson. He's off somewhere because he rose to, I guess you could almost say, prime minister of Babylon. He had like a second powerful position in the government, and he was, I'm sure, had to be somewhere doing something with the country's business or whatever, but he was not mentioned in this, but his 3 friends are. And so we're going to look at this, and it's kind of to set the stage of it. The Babylon is basically, this is the second time a king from Babylon is going to try to set himself up as God. Right. And in fact, we're going to see that in previous verses, not in our lesson, that he had a great golden statue made of himself. And This golden statue was set it's called the Plain of Dura. And actually, if you look at the Plain of Dura, it actually takes in almost all of what was called Mesopotamia at that time. But this statue wasn't just any little park statue. It tells us that the image was 60 cubits high and about 6 cubits wide. For those that didn't know about the word cubit, in the Bible, a cubit is normally considered to be about 18 inches. And in some cases, even they stretch it to 24. So what that means is this particular image was at least was going to be 90 feet high. So that's a pretty good sized statue there. But the idea was Nebuchadnezzar wanted everybody to be able to see it from wherever they were. And they're getting ready to dedicate this statue, and everybody is going to, at the sound of the trumpets, everybody is to bow down and honor this image. Well, that creates a little bit of a problem for Daniel's friends, because they know what their law says about bowing down to statues and golden and images and so forth. So they kind of in a dilemma. And as you mentioned, this is kind of we're in this middle of these faith lessons. We're going to see what true faith is today.
Yeah, we really are. And you look at, Daniel, who's the author of the book that we're studying here today, and then the three main characters, which are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's not shocking to know and learn that these folks rose to prominence. These Hebrew men rose to prominence within this culture, within the government of Babylon, because when the Babylonians went and exiled the Hebrews or the Israelites to Babylon, they took the very best.
Right.
At least in the first, it was kind of a wave of priorities, really. They took the very first wave, they took the very, very best, the top tier of society. So after the third wave, if you were one of the ones left, you probably had a complex, because you probably weren't worth much to society.
Exactly. They didn't do much for their self-image, did they?
So it's not shocking here to see these men had risen to positions of prominence within the government, and that's going to kind of exacerbate the reaction here we're going to see from King Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, and we're going to pick up right before as they're getting ready to dedicate this statue, and part, like I said, that's already passed by is the fact that these three men, when the king asked them if they would bow, they told him, no, we will not bow before your statue. He even gave them a second chance.
Yep.
And when he did, and they denied him, he became furious.
All right, so let's get rolling here. And we're going to see here in the first section of verses 19 through 23, it's going to talk about into the fire. And we're going to see how that, you can relate that back to practical application in the lives of all of us today.
Right.
And we're going to begin with verses 19 and 20 of Daniel chapter 3. And God's word says this: Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So really in an utter arrogance here, Coach, Nebuchadnezzar, the temperamental king of Babylon, commanded everyone to worship a golden idol like you talked about. And a couple of them aren't wanting to do that here.
Right. The three boys here they're young men by now, but the idea is they will not go against what God has given them in the law, telling them that you never bow down to a statue. Right. You're demeaning God then. And the king's anger was something the people were used to. He was one of these guys that when things didn't go his way, they knew it right away because he let them have it. It hadn't been too long before when we met Daniel and the boys there, when the king had a dream and he asked his wise men to interpret the dream, and they couldn't do it. and he had them all killed right there. So it wasn't, you didn't want to make the king mad. But the idea here is that he is very angry here, especially after offering these are Jews now. They're not Babylonians. They are Jewish people that are defying him. And he is not taking it lying down or taking it lightly. So and everybody knew that what the punishment was going to be before this time if you didn't bow down. Everybody knew that they'd already arranged that you were going to be thrown in the fire, in the furnace. So these three boys who denied the king, knowing very well what lay ahead of them, but they still would not go against what God had told them to do. So again, we can see their faith here. But the idea is they're willing to go against the king and do something that they know is going to be probably mean their death, very possibly. So that's the position that they're in right now. And like we said, Daniel is not here. He may have been able to do something to calm the situation, but he's not even mentioned.
Well, there's an interesting piece of this here too, Coach, in verse 19, when it says, and his attitude toward them changed.
Right.
That means that he probably had a good rapport with them. Mm-hmm. That there was maybe even a trustworthy relationship, and they had reached positions within the government, within his rule, where he actually placed his trust in them.
Right.
And for them to blatantly deny and not comply, it really infuriated him much quicker than just an average citizen out on the street.
Right.
That this really cut him to the core, and we all know Nebuchadnezzar's history and his behavior. So it says here his attitude toward them changed. So it probably went from maybe he was kind of in a fatherly like way, strongly recommending that they comply, to I don't need you here anymore.
Right.
And
you betrayed me, basically, is a type of betrayal.
So he's going to make an example out of him, and it says here in 19 and 20 that he had the furnace heated 7 times hotter than it normally is. And this was a common method of execution, and they did it to make examples out of people. And normally they wouldn't fire the flame up that hot because they would want the person to actually suffer a little more, and make a longer event happen, so that when people are watching, it would serve as an example and what not to do. So there's a lot going on here just within these first couple verses, and he got the strongest men that he had. And that was a message too within itself.
Right.
So we'll go ahead and move on now to that first question that we have here, and that is, and it kind of relates to us because these 3 Hebrew men are faced with a situation where all they got left to do is trust God here.
Right.
So what consequences do Christians face today for standing up for what is right?
Well, we don't have to look very far to see some of those consequences that are taking place right now. I mean, you turn on news and things that you hear them discussing what's going on, and one of the first things you hear today is something about censorship of speech, of free speech, that Christians are being stifled, and if they get on Twitter or some of these other social medias, they're told by the government take them off. And a lot of what they say, just the fact if we claim that we are Christians, or if we claim that we believe in God, and this is, they have put that up as being as hate speech is what they call it. So there's one of the first things we see right here today, and it's going to get worse for Christians. It's not getting any better. We're also labeled by people in groups, where sometimes Christians are called racists and bigots and everything, because our view is different than their view, and people look at us, the fact that they don't want to agree with what we're saying. So rather than just disagree, they want to come out and try to, as I said, censor us or put names on us to put us in a bad light. And and unfortunately, it evens to the point where this may come down to where we're even ostracized from our own families and friends and people we work with, because the Christians, every time we talk about we're a Christian, that lets other people. It kind of makes them realize, oh, here's this stuff again. I'm hearing about Christianity, and what they don't realize, it's simply this is a way that God's asked them again, or gives them a choice again. To come and talk about that, So, Christians are not anti anybody, but the thing that we can't go along with what is not in God's will. Yep. And I heard a saying a long time ago that fits right in, and it says, nothing is politically correct if it's morally wrong. and those are things that you hear today. So those are things that Christians are seeing, and it's going to get worse. The Bible tells us that.
Yeah, you look at this question, Coach, and this is a real question that people need to realize today, and a lot of them already are. But when you are with other Christians, it's real easy to hold firm to your beliefs.
Right.
That's real easy to do. But when you get amongst people who disagree with Christianity, you need all the courage that can be offered to you and God's strength to stand up for what is right. In these situations, we might be tempted to compromise our convictions about what is right. And it's real easy to do that just to get along. But, the consequences of that are number one is criticism. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing. Believers standing up for God's truth will likely get criticized by people for their beliefs.
Yeah.
And another one is just flat out not only being criticized, but flat out rejection, and being completely shut off. And if we live by our convictions or verbally share our faith, we may not be accepted by those. Mm-hmm. So that's another one. And still yet another one is fear of loss. Mm-hmm. And you've already touched on some of this: fear of loss of family, fear of loss of relationships. Yeah. It could be a lot of different fear of loss of your speech. Mm-hmm. And we see that eroding every day in the culture we currently live in. Fear of losing your money, your possessions, all of that exists for not standing up. If you do stand up for what is right, that could be a fallout of what you could lose. And sacrificing standards in order to please others will keep us from the fullness that God intended for us to begin with. So as God's people, we hold on to our convictions no matter the consequences. And we're going to see a great example of that here in just a second.
That's what this lesson's about. And two, we don't want to forget, Mike, that we are fortunate to live where we do, because there are a lot of places that standing up for Christianity costs people their lives.
Yep.
We're fortunate that hasn't got to that point yet here in our country, but we're not. It's coming this way if we don't get it stopped.
Yep, totally agree. All right, let's look at verse 21. So these men wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tied up in their coats, in their stockings, in their hats, and in their garments, and really in everything that would have been worn in a typical Babylonian day at that point.
Right. And, what clothes it was, some scholars think that these clothes themselves were very flammable. And it just added to the anticipation of them starting to be burnt. So they were all had all the robes and everything, right to their hats, their turbans, everything was and they were taken to be thrown into the fire. And again, you can imagine what faith or what grace it took for these young men, knowing that this is where they're heading. And one thing we want to understand too is that when the king talked to them about why they were doing this, and he asked them a second time, he said, will you now worship not the idol and worship me as a god? And they said they wouldn't. He said, well, why not? And they told him that they could not because of the law of God. They said, and king, they said, whatever you do, it says it's not going to matter because God will take care of us. Yep. And that's their idea. Even if God doesn't save them, they know that God will still see that things come out all right.
Yeah, and, living in this culture and being at these high positions within the government, they would have probably seen executions done like this before, so they knew exactly what was happening and what they were getting into. And a lot of scholars believe too, Coach, that the fact that they were clothed, they still had their clothes, meant that the king was so furious and in such a hurry to get them into the furnace, he didn't allow his soldiers time to even take their clothes off. Yeah, they just bound them and put them in, let alone it did make them a little more flammable. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times what they would do is they would diminish the heat to make the punishment more agonizing and last a little longer. Right. And so these guys are looking into the furnace. They know exactly what they were getting into. And when I was a little boy, my dad was a first responder, a firefighter. Mm-hmm. And he had been gone the entire night, and he'd come home, and I was just a little fella, and you like to swing on your dad's arm and all that, and I was wanting to romp around a little bit, and he sat down in his chair in the corner, and he was gray and pasty looking, and that wasn't normal for him. And I started wanting to romp and everything, and he just looked at me and said, "Son, I need some time tonight. You need to leave me alone." And he said, "I just watched a man burn alive in a plane crash, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it, and all I could hear was the scream." Mm-hmm. And you have to imagine that things like that were going through Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's mind as all this was unfolding.
Right.
And that takes us to verse 22, and we're going to combine that with 23 as well. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the three men firmly tied fell into the blazing furnace. So angry outbursts followed by acts of harshness were really typical for Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, yeah, he was one of those like that, and later on he paid for that harshness. But right here the idea is, we don't know how hot 7 times hotter is than what it really was, but we know it was hot.
Right.
If taking the soldiers, taking them to the fire, if they were killed, the fire got to them, how hot it had to be. And, they were either overcome with the heat or something that had killed them. And then, of course, the three boys fell into the fire or were shoved into the fire, whatever. But it was an extremely, extremely hot fire that they had. And like you mentioned before, this to show you that Nebuchadnezzar, how mad he was. Like you said, if he had really wanted to see him suffer, he wouldn't have had the fire that hot.
Yep.
But he just wants to get him punished. That's all he's thinking about.
Yeah, and here we have the 3 Hebrew men, and they actually fell into the fire. So that means that the strongest soldiers that Nebuchadnezzar had at his disposal got them up there and got them where they could just fall in. But they died too. Yeah. And we really don't know whether it's through asphyxiation, whether their lungs burnt, whatever it was. But the fire was so hot. Normally they would have had time to prepare to go up and take somebody to shield themselves from the heat. And again, it kind of shows the haste of Nebuchadnezzar by not allowing these soldiers a chance to prepare to do this. So they were casualties as well here.
Right.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, and the furnace, as we understand it, was kind of like a great big pizza oven is today. You know, it had like two or three chambers to it, and one was where the fire was, and then it had a flue coming out of it, which gave a chance to get air in there, of course, which just fanned the flames even more. And it really did its job because it had to be that hot in order to kill those men that way.
Well, the king is absolutely furious, and he is showing it at all angles here.
All right.
And that takes us to that next question, Coach, and that is, how can we cling to our faith when it feels like our world is crumbling? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were sitting there looking at the furnace, and they had a chance to bow down and worship this idol. They refused to do it. How do you keep your faith at times like that?
Well, you know, you look at their example and you wonder how they could, you know, if you put yourself in their place. And the first, you know, thing that obviously comes to mind is, in order to do that, you have to have a deep personal relationship with God or with Jesus Christ. And it's not one of these, you know, fly by night type of relationships. You got to have someone where you look at Christ as being your best friend and the one that controls the future for you and everything. So it's really tests your relationship and see if it's really true or not, and see if you're really having the kind of relationship that God wants to have with you. But it puts you in that kind of situation. And everybody gets there eventually, because you know, as we get older, we know we're getting having less and less time. We're going to be here on earth till God calls us home, and when the time comes, we don't know when it's going to be. But you know, you got to be ready, because we're going to face things. Maybe not face a furnace, but we're going to face things that we know we're going to face death. Yeah. And you know, we have to have that personal relationship with Christ in order to be able to overcome that. We need to also realize, as far as our life goes, that life is like a race, but even Paul calls it a race. But our race in life is not a 100-yard dash; it's a marathon. Right. And we have to learn to take things like that. Yeah, you get bad news along the way and everything, but you know, you always have hope to look for Christ. To, just like these boys said, this is what's amazing to me about them. They said, even King, if you throw us in the fire and we burn up, we still believe God can save us. You know, so they had their trust and faith in God, and that's where you are when you're on the brink of death. You got to make a choice. If you haven't made one, are you going to trust Christ or not? And people that say there's no such thing, how do you know? What if we're right? You know, and just because you disagree with us, you know, are you willing to take that chance? Yeah. And so again, life is a marathon. It's not the 100-yard dash that some people try to run it as. Do things like find a prayer partner, especially if you're struggling. Get somebody to pray with you and meet with them. Study either Bible study groups, or do a lot of Bible study with maybe somebody that's a partner of yours. And I've mentioned this before. My wife was a good one she picked out really comforting scriptures and made little pin-ups with it and put them around on the cabinets and things. So you see them every time you turn around and go into a new room, and it's comforting. And one other thing that people like to do is they like to journal. They like to put their things down, not only just to write down what happened to them, but so they can go back some other time and look, what did God do when I was here? Right. You know, it gives you kind of a history to go back and see, and little things like that don't seem like they would mean much, they end up being really, really important.
Yeah, they really do. And you look at this question, how can we cling to our faith when it's really, really hard, when it's really tough? And the first thing is, you got to remember, God is in control. Mm-hmm. And even in our worst circumstances, we have to remember that God has a plan and a purpose for every situation. And sometimes that's hard to see in the middle of the fire, which we're going to read about here in a second. Right. And the other is, practice contentment. Be content in the middle of that fire, whatever that is. So many quote the following verse: I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And a lot of them really don't even understand the context of that. I guarantee you that these three Hebrew men never saw this verse. It was written many years later, but they certainly understood exactly what it was. And another one is you can pray, which you talked about really with shameless audacity. I mean, just pray from your sincerest, most weakest point from your heart, and God will hear you. And you mentioned this too. Ask for help.
Right.
You got prayer partners and people all around you that are willing to do that. You can also do it through serving the Lord and really just not complaining, keeping quiet, and going about your business like you normally would. Because not all of it's an immediate consequence like a fire. Some of it you're living in that trial every day of your life. So there's a lot of different ways you can take care of that.
As you know, I had a perfect example in my own home of this. My wife, who passed away a couple years ago, she went through years and years of pain and operations and sickness and everything. And a lot of people, when they would get ready to go back or leave after they'd visited, they would tell me, said, how can she bless me more when I came to bless them? And that's just the kind of person she was, you know, and she had faith right up to her death. So,
nothing could be more true.
Yeah. So
it was truly a big blessing to be around her. It was amazing. And that takes us to our next section here, and we're going to see the next section is going to talk about God in the fire. And this is really, really a neat piece of this in verses 24 through 28. Verse 24 says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, Certainly, Your Majesty. So throughout the entire book of Daniel, Coach, and the leaders in Babylon reacted with fear and amazement when God demonstrated miraculous power, and we see the same thing happening right here.
Yeah, when God showed up in the Old Testament, it was always for a very memorable occasion, and this is no exception. So the king, who expected, first of all, when those boys got in the fire or were pushed in the fire, that they would be screaming and they would be burn up in an instant, and so he must have had maybe a little window or something that he could look into that furnace, and to his surprise, when he went in, not only were the boys not burned up, they were up walking around and as if nothing was going. And the thing that we find out is, as we will read, all of their bindings that had been, when they bound them before they threw them in, those were gone. They disappeared. And then, to his great surprise, he's got his advisors here, and you see him looking over. Didn't we only put 3 guys in there? And he said, I see a 4th man in there. And then if we look at it, that this is just amazing him. He cannot figure out what's going on. So he's going from being super angry and just uncontrollably angry to now it's wonderment, to where he can't figure out. He's totally confused with what's going on here. And so he even asks his advisors, I think, look here, do you see 4 men in there? And of course they did. So, because there was 4 men in there now. So they say, certainly, Your Majesty. Of course, they're going to tell him what he wants to hear anyway.
Yeah. Well, they are. And the king's got a lot of bitterness here. And because of that bitterness, and I really do feel like if this were an average citizen that he was sentencing to death, he probably would have just said, take care of it, and turned and walked away.
Yeah.
But, Scripture indicates and implies he stayed there to personally witness this.
Oh, yeah.
He had a view, and he wanted to watch this happen. Right. And he was anticipating great gratification. And also, see, I told you so to everybody that was there watching, as an example.
Right.
But now he sees something different, which is going to be pretty neat here as we move along. And that takes us to verse 25. And it says, He said, Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. So the identity of the fourth walking around, Coach, has been the subject of a lot of discussion over the years, and you and I land exactly in the same spot as to who that fourth one was.
Yeah, it's the way it's interpreted from the different, the different scriptures we get as to what exactly it says. Ours said, if this fourth one, he said, looks like the son of gods. Now we know that he was a god worshiper in the way of the pantheism, where they worshipped idols and the earth and so forth. And of course, he wanted to be a god. That's why they made that big statue and wanted to be worshipped like a god. But he sees that. He says that fourth man looks like what he, not that he's actually recognizing him as being Jesus, if that's who it is. He's just saying it's like one of the gods he would expect. That's what their son would look like. Yeah. So we're not sure exactly what he meant by that. But the more you read this, and the more you look at other aspects in the Old Testament, when it talked about in these words, the Son of God, or in almost all cases, those ended up being capitalized in the Scripture, which you and I take as meaning this is none other than Christ Himself, Christ incarnate, so. I think that there's a lot of good reasons to believe that truly is Jesus Christ in His pre-incarnate form coming down to save these boys. So that's, whether it is or whether it isn't, it's still the fact that the great miracle is taking place here.
Yeah, and I truly believe it was Jesus Himself. And these 3 Hebrew men, they were prepared to die for their faith, Coach.
Right.
And knowing God was not obligated in any way to rescue them.
Right.
They were accepting whatever God's will was at that time. But they trusted the Lord would do what was best, and here the faith is validated. Mm-hmm. And the preservation of these faithful 3 guys in this fiery furnace, Coach, to put it in your words, was miraculous.
Right.
It truly was. And there's really no other explanation. There isn't anything like that. You either accept it or you reject it.
Right.
And either the book of Daniel is misrepresenting things or it is telling the truth. And I believe, and I know you believe, that it is telling the truth. So you either believe the miracle or you don't. No, 3 men cannot be thrown into a fiery furnace without absolute destruction and being burned alive unless a miracle takes place. And I believe a miracle took place. And I believe the fourth person there was none other than Jesus Himself.
Yeah. And this is an historical record. I mean, this in the Jewish history. This is recorded as history.
Yeah.
And so it's not like doesn't have some backing yet. But again, the fact that and I'm going to mention this again later on too. That reasons why we think this is Christ in there, the whole thing boils down to the fact that, it's these men, like you said, even they understood that if God didn't save them, He could.
Yeah.
That's their faith. Then it was up to that's the thing. You put your faith in God and then let Him have control. That's what makes it a lot easier to live life as it is today.
Yeah. All right, let's look at verse 26 and 27. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. So upon seeing the fourth figure, the king, Coach, experienced a change of heart.
Yes, he did. Yeah, and again, you notice he's got all these people around him, and you can imagine all the stuff that's going through what they're saying. The word miracle had to be mentioned many, many times. What they saw, and the thing that we see, the change of heart that Nebuchadnezzar has here, is to the point where he may not believe that this is truly a God, a God that did this miracle. But what he is coming to the conclusion of is that God is a whole lot more powerful than our gods. That's the change of heart that he's having here. And I don't want to leave this without bringing this in. As we mentioned, Daniel is a book that's kind of the unabridged short version of Revelation. And this is really a great picture of the part that we had when we studied Revelation, called the tribulation period. Yeah. If you look at it, the fiery furnace can represent all the suffering that people will go through during that tribulation. And we talked about how horrendous that suffering would be for those that go through it. And of course, we know that if you become a Christian, you can escape that. Then Nebuchadnezzar kind of represents the one that was called the beast, which is the Antichrist that everybody's heard of. That's kind of a picture of the Antichrist who will rise to be the leader of the world during that period of time. The image of gold could represent what the Bible talks about and calls it the abomination of desolation. And it is some type of a statue that the Antichrist puts into the temple and desecrates the temple. So that's what the image of gold could represent. The three Hebrew children could represent what's called the remnant of the Jews that will survive that tribulation. And then the fact that Daniel was not mentioned in this chapter at all, because we said he's probably out on kingdom business. Well, he's kind of the picture of those that will be raptured before the tribulation and taken out of all that.
The church.
Which is the church. That's right. So this is a really neat, if you look at it and compare it to what's going to happen after Christ comes back, his second coming, we call the Great Tribulation. This is a real down-to-earth picture of that, and I don't think that's by accident.
It certainly isn't. It's a great illustration of what occurs in the book of Revelation. And you look at these men here, Coach. The trial had no power over these men because they had firmly submitted to God's will.
Right.
And before the time of Jesus, they knew the truth of Jesus' promise, even though they really had never heard it probably. But in the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. And that's in John chapter 16, looking at 33. And the fact that they absolutely did not have any sense of smoke, smell, or anything on them really shows you how complete the deliverance was that they had. Not only were, what was binding them when they went into the furnace gone and totally removed, but they actually had no smell on them at all, which showed absolute and complete deliverance.
Right. And that kind of reminds us of, when we accept Christ, and we're talking about, in the last days, it says that we are totally absolved of all our sins, and we are given a set of righteous robes to put on. And that's kind of like, I think these guys were just came out with nothing, no smoke at all, nothing, and we talk about, hell has nothing to do with a Christian. You don't go into the fires. And Christ, of course, was the one who saved them, just like he will be the one that saves us, from the fires of hell and judgment. He was the one that took care of all the sins that we have. As the Bible says, they're washed as white as snow now.
Yep. All right, let's go to verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And the king's confession of worship resulted really, Coach, from the character and the faithfulness of these three Hebrew men.
Right, you can tell that it had an impact on Nebuchadnezzar. He as much as he didn't want to say that, that their God is, is better than his gods, or that their God is the God. He actually did. He acknowledged the fact that his, at least the God of the Israelites, was stronger than his gods, and he acknowledges that these three guys are certainly servants of that God. He was impressed with how much they were willing to bargain with or to give up for their God, and the idea that again, that not even a hair was singed, it says, or smell of smoke. The fire had absolutely did nothing to them, and so that he grants that their God is superior to his God, and I think that later on we know that after God really got a hold of him, even Nebuchadnezzar, we are told, repented and turned to the God of Israel. So this was the beginning of it. He had no explanation to explain this miracle that happened. There was no way to explain it, and his for anybody else for that matter. So it took him a long time to get away from his paganism and everything, but God got his attention, and he even went insane for a while because he ended up becoming like an animal. And actually, he went out and grazed, and it said, with the cattle in the grass, right, and would eat grass and so forth for 7 years. But eventually he came back and he gave his life to, or really believed in the God of Israel.
Think about Nebuchadnezzar here. He's kind of been on a spiritual and an emotional journey here during this event.
You might call it a roller coaster.
You might call it a roller coaster, but you think about it, probably never in his life before had he ever seen commitment to this level. Mm-hmm. So once this was all over, not did he only have a spiritual awakening, but he had a different set of understanding for who these three men were.
Right.
And he saw a level of commitment probably never seen before by anybody there. So he wanted that. He mm-hmm. thought, if these men are this committed to what they believe in, I want that to be part of my government here. So we learn later on that he edified and honored them even further, right, within his government and his kingdom that he had. So it's a great ride here for Nebuchadnezzar, and we do see him have a spiritual awakening. And that takes us to that last question, Coach, and that is, does God always deliver us from our trials? And that's kind of a baited question a little bit.
Yeah, the best way I could come up with the answer to begin with is, it's in the long term, yes. In the short term, maybe not. Because again, we know that God will sometimes, in the short term, if you're going through struggles, he will, even miraculously at times. I know of people that have literally had miracles in their lives, and I firmly believe they're miracles from God. And he heals people that are sick, or there's something that he does for them that blesses them in a way that could only come from God. And so in the short term, maybe yes or maybe not. And the other thing is, and again, we're all getting to that point, is we want to live, but we may get a disease, and God will simply say, no, that's I'm not going to heal that, and people end up dying. But the thing is that if you're not a Christian now, this doesn't apply to you.
Right.
But if you're a Christian, we got to understand that even if God doesn't heal you here, you're about to be healed once you enter heaven. So yes, in that way, he does deliver us. But, like I said, he may not deliver us from what's going on down here, but eventually he will deliver us in a way that no one else can deliver. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says this too, as we're going through all these things down here and we feel like, God, where are you? We talked about well, we feel like saying, God, are you still there? And but 1 Corinthians 10:13 tells us this: no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tested and tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So basically, this scripture tells us that when we're going through these hard things and we don't know how we're going to make it, God's still there if we call on him. And this is where the relationship that we have to establish, you should have established throughout your life with him. You learned it, as these young boys did, you learned to depend on that providence from God, and that you can, the temptations and that you're going through and the hardships, there's nothing you're going to get that you can't stand, because you're not going to be alone. Yeah. That's the big thing. We need to understand we're never alone with God, with Christ. He's always there. He goes right through things with us. Whether God delivers us or not, we also find out that it will come out to be good. Like I said, he may deliver us from whatever we're going through, or it may not happen till we get to heaven, but we can be sure that we have a life ahead of us that's better. And Romans 8:28 says that, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So everything that happens, whether we believe it or not, it's really God is taking us through the best thing for us.
Yeah. And those of you who are watching or listening to us right now, everybody goes through something. Maybe you're going through something right now. Maybe you're really struggling with something, or you're going through the fire right now. Maybe not like these guys were, but maybe a fire in your life. No matter the pain or the suffering you're going through right now, God has promised to deliver you from the struggle.
Right.
He may not deliver you out of the trial, but he will deliver you through the trial. And that kind of explains what you were talking about, Coach. And Hebrews 13:5 says this: God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And so God delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but they had to go through the fire.
Right.
And God will deliver you. You just have to be patient and trust him, but you might have to go through the fire just like these Hebrew men did.
Right, but you have to have faith, and you have to have Christ in your life. You can't do this alone. It's one of those things, you can't do it alone. And knowing that God is always right there with you is a comfort that you can't get any other way.
Yeah. And that takes us to our thought to remember, and that is this: because of God's faithfulness, we can be faithful to him. And Coach, what a fitting thought to remember to wrap this thing up. And could you give us some final words here as we put a conclusion to this lesson today?
Yeah, the idea about faith, we need to understand that we serve a God whose faithfulness is incomparable. We can always count on him. And again, it may not be the way we want it, but it always turns out to be the best. Because you think of things that seem so terrible, but then when it passes, or you look beyond the immediate problems, you find out that there's a rainbow at the end for you. And again, sometimes we're not going to sugarcoat it. Sometimes it's death, but there are worse things than death down here. So, and that's what these boys had already decided. They didn't. Obviously they wanted to live, but they just simply put it in God's hands. Yep. And that's where your faith comes in. Are you willing to put whatever you're going through in his hands and then not worry about it? We try to put it in God's hands, but then we hang on to it and worry about it, and it just makes us miserable. And these things are going to happen no matter what. So, but let God just promises that whatever comes of it will be the absolute best for you. But that also works for other people. It's used in so many ways that God can't just worry about just you. He's got a whole world to worry about, and you are a big part of that. And if you do His will, you will serve His purpose for you.
Yeah, when we begin this session, Coach, with the thought of, have you ever been in a situation or faced with a trial where the only option you had left was to absolutely have faith and trust God? And if you have any questions about that, we would love to hear from you. This is Pine Grove Baptist Church in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and you should see the contact information on the screen. If you have any questions about anything we've talked about, we would love to hear from you. We do hear from people from time to time. For those of you who watch, maybe this is your very first time, we would encourage you to share this message with your contacts out on whatever social media platform it is that you subscribe to. It just gets the word out. And we're also out on podcast platform, so you can share that as well. We thank each one of you for making us part of your week. We don't take it for granted, and we do see it as a very, very dear privilege. Next week, the title of our study is Faith in Times of Trouble. And we're going to continue in the book of Daniel, this time in chapter 6. So until next time, this is Mike Cornell, along with Coach Ron Lathey, and our production team, Andy and Courtney Holbrook, wishing everybody have a blessed week, and we hope to see you real soon.